Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dear students, Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to the course of History of English Literature, New Classics to Date. Today, the topic of our lecture is one of the important personality of 18th century literature, and the name of this personality is Alexander Pope. I'm your teacher, Muhammad Asif Khan, Lecturer, Department of English, Guwahati University of Science and Technology. Discussion agenda for this lecture is that first of all we will discuss 18th century literature and the characteristics of the classical school of poetry, and after this initial discussion we will move towards the main discussion of today's lecture, and that is Alexander Pope. In this lecture we will focus on the style of Alexander Pope, and we will talk about the literary works, the important literary works of Alexander Pope. So first of all we will review 18th century literature, and this is the literature which is divided into two distinct periods. And the first period of 18th century literature is named as Age of Pope, and that is the personality which is the title of today's lecture. And Age of Pope started in 1700 and it continued up to 1745. The second important personality of 18th century is Dr. Samuel Johnson, and the time period between 1745 and 1785 is often named as Age of Dr. Johnson. We see that this very time period and the literature of this time period has numerous characteristics, and for that reason the literature of this time period is named with different titles, and some of the common titles that are being used for 18th century literature, these very titles are the New Classical Period, or the Classical Age, or the Augustan Age. And we see that the literature of 18th century is also referred as the Age of Good Sense, or the Age of Reason, or Age of Enlightenment. And we see that sometime this very time period is referred as the Age of Prose. So these are some of the important names which are often associated with the 18th century literature. And we see there are two important personalities, Alexander Pope and Dr. Samuel Johnson, who dominated the literature of this century. Now let's move towards the characteristics of the classical school of poetry. Actually, the 18th century literature, which is referred as the classical age, and we see that the poetry of this time period is the product of intelligence, and we see that it is intelligence playing upon the surface of the daily life. So it is actually a mixture of intellect and the common daily life happenings that is often a product of realism. But on the other side we see that this literature or this poetry is deficient in emotions and imagination, which was the main feature of the literature of Elizabethans, and most of the time a romantic literature that is based on emotions and imaginations. This poetry, the literature of 18th century, is commonly we see that didactic, and it has that strain of satire in it, and there is a lacking of emotions and imagination. One another thing which we see, especially in the literature of the 18th century, is that this literature and the poetry of this time is very much argumentative. We will see that arguments are being given in the support of the issues or the problems that are being raised in that poetry. And in this poetry we find criticism of political and other important personalities of that very time period. Even literary personalities were criticized in the poetry and literature of this time period. Important feature of this poetry is that it is exclusively town poetry. And we see that the critical taste of the time was very unsympathetic towards the predecessors. We see that they are not that much having a relation with their predecessors, they are not that much sympathetic towards Chaucer or Shakespeare or other important personalities of the time period that was before them. Actually, they were more concerned about the classics of the Romans and the Greeks. So we see the unsympathetic attitude of the writers of this time period towards their predecessors. And we see that one of the important feature of the classical school is that they are extremely devoted to the form, and they were specially putting their efforts to polish their style. And that very style was often we see that a superficial style, and this superficial polished style often resulted into a very highly artificial and conventional style. Though they were trying to improve their form and they were having a love for a polished style, but that polished style often created artificiality in their literature. We also see that prose occupied the front position in 18th century, or this very classical literature, and this development that prose occupied the front position was very rapid, and we see that the prose writers of this age excelled the poets in every respect. And the reason behind that rise of prose, or this very aspect that prose occupied the front position, was that poetry was considered inadequate for the task of raising the controversies that were there in the society of 18th century. And if someone is writing poetry, we often feel that this very poetry has a prosaic style, and poetry was very polished, witty, and that often resulted into artificial style, and there was lack of fire, there was lack of fine feeling, enthusiasm, emotions, and often it is referred as something that is lacking in imagination. Another important feature of this age was that we see the origin and development of novel in this time period. So two important ages, the age of Pope and the age of Johnson. These two personalities dominated the literature of this era, and the age of Pope is that age in which we see that the classical rules and ideals gained supremacy. But in the age of Johnson, that was in the last quarter of 18th century, we see that cracks begin to appear in the edifice of classicism, and in the form of the writers of that time period. We see revolts against its ideals, and there is a tendency of revival of romanticism. So there is a change because we see the seeds of romanticism in some of the important writers and poets of Age of Johnson. So these are some of the characteristics which I explained to you before going into the discussion of today's lecture. And 18th century literature is divided into two distinct periods, Age of Pope and Age of Dr. Samuel Johnson. And there are many names which are associated with 18th century literature. Then we discussed the main characteristics of the classical school, and we see that the literature of this time period is product of intelligence. We see realism, lacking of emotions and imagination, and often we observe that the poetry or the literature of this time period is didactic and satiric. So these are the main characteristics of classical school of poetry. Now let's move towards the main topic of today's lecture, and that is Alexander Pope. This man was born on 21st May 1688, and he died on 30th May 1744. So he is one of the greatest English poets, and we see that he was the leading poet of the early 18th century, and this very man dominated that era between 1700 to 1745. His parents were Catholics, and we see that being a Catholic, he had to face a number of restrictions, and he had to labor under various restrictions. For that reason, his education was affected, and there were a number of hurdles that really he has to face because of his religion. But he is the man that after Shakespeare, we see that Pope is the second most quoted writer in English, and he represents in himself all the main characteristics of 18th century literature. Though there were restrictions, there were many hurdles that affected his life, but we see that if someone has a talent, no one can stop him. Even very strict restrictions can't bound that personality within the limits. Though we see that government was there that was against the Catholic religion, there were many other hurdles in the life of Alexander Pope, and we see that he was very invalid, and from invalid I mean that he was very weak person, and often he was sick, and because of that he was of small stature and very delicate constitution. He suffered from a number of nervous system problems, and throughout his life we see that he suffered the cruel headache, and he himself referred this very issue of his life as a long disease. He referred his life as a long disease. But the wonder is that in spite of all these handicaps, or in spite of all these manifold restrictions, manifold problems, this small, ugly man has left a permanent mark on the literature of his age. We see that Pope is considered as the greatest poet of the 18th century literature, and Professor Atton has referred him as the Prince of Classicism. So these are some of the initial introduction which I want to give to you. And now we see that after discussing all these hurdles which he had in the life, he was very intelligent, and he was extremely ambitious and capable of tremendous industry in life, And we see that these qualities brought him to the front rank of men of letters of 18th century. And not only the man of letters of 18th century, in overall English literature we see that he is one of the important personalities. And during his lifetime he was looked upon as a model poet. So Alexander Pope is one of the important personalities in English literature. When we look at the style of Alexander Pope, we see that he uses satire in his works, and basically satire is that form of literature in which the writer reforms through ridiculing the different aspects of life, and it is often characterized by lack of tolerance for human imperfection. And we see in satires it involves an ideal, and the writer condemns those who fail to live up to this ideal. So it is a bitter humor, but this humor is basically for the sake of correction, or for the sake of reforming that very thing, rather than simply laughing at someone. So satire is one of the important tools which Alexander Pope used in his writing. He also used mock epic, that is actually a parody of epic, and it is a form of satire adapted to elevate style. And we see that in this very form Alexander Pope copied or parodied the classical epic poem, but he has used very trivial or very small petty subjects in his mock epics. Another important feature of his poetry is that he used heroic couplet, and heroic couplet is that couplet written in iambic pentameter. And when we see his epic, that we often observe that heroic couplet is attributed to epic. Alexander used heroic couplet to emphasize the seriousness of matter. So he was using heroic couplet in his mock epics, and he perfected this heroic couplet in his poetry. He was using rhymes to create musicality and to keep tone mild and light. Though on the one side he was satiring the community, on the other hand he was using musicality to keep his tone mild and light. He used masquerade, and basically that is the mockery of corrupted society and its hypocrisy and pretentious behaviors which are often being used by the people of 18th century. So he was the critic of that artificial style of that very time, and he was against that hypocrisy of or pretentious behavior that was often being depicted by the people of 18th century. So 18th century is also referred as Enlightenment era, and we see that Alexander Pope, rather than simply giving the moral code as we see in the poetry of Chaucer, Geoffrey Chaucer and William Langland, we see that Alexander Pope used satire to show the actual face of the society with expectations of reaction in the form of a reform. Chaucer was not trying to reform the society. Alexander Pope is basically a reformer. He expects change, he expects reaction, and often he wants to see reform in the society. So these are some of the important characteristics of the style of Alexander Pope. Satire, he used mock epics, he used heroic couplets, rhymes, masquerades, and his tone was often mild, but he actually wanted to reform the society. So these are some of the important characteristics of Alexander Pope. Now let's move towards the works of Alexander Pope. We see that when we discuss the works of Alexander Pope, there are essays in verses, letter in verses, and some of the important poems in verse. Though in 18th century we often refer this very thing, that 18th century is that time period in which prose came to the front position, but Alexander Pope is more or less connected to poetry, but his poetic forms, he is using the techniques, or he is using those forms of the literature which are often in the prose form, but he changed those forms, like we see essays in verse and letters in verse in the works of Alexander Pope. Now let's see one by one the important literary works of Alexander Pope. We can divide his works into three periods. In the first period, we see that important works of Alexander Pope includes 4 pastorals, and these 4 pastorals were among the first published poems of Alexander Pope, and we see that these poems appeared in 1709, and these poems were actually written in 1704, but at that time Alexander Pope was only 16, and he just passed these very poems among his friends in a manuscript form, and later on, because of the popularity of these works, we see that he published these works after 5 years in 1709. So these 4 pastorals are short poems, and these poems deals the topic of spring, autumn and winter, and actually these 4 pastorals are closely fashioned on the Virgil style, who is one of the important Roman poet. So Alexander Pope, who is actually major classicist writer, and we see that in his first major work he has tried to copy Virgil's style. The second important work of Alexander Pope is the essay on criticism, and this very work was published in 1711. So this work was published when he was only 21 years old, and again this work was inspired by the ancient writers. We see throughout the poem Alexander Pope is referring to the ancient writers, and we see the personalities like Virgil, Homer, Aristotle, Horace and Longinus are the important men that are being referred by Alexander Pope in essays on criticism. So this shows that he believes that the imitation of these ancient is the ultimate standard for taste. So these personalities served as models, and Alexander Pope actually wants to live up to these ideals. So these are the people, and Alexander Pope wants to be the right follower of these giants of literature. Here, one another important aspect of the essays on criticism is that the landscape of this work is also copied out of the Greek and Latin poets, and there is lacking He just took that material from the works of the great writers rather than from the first-hand knowledge of what he professed to describe. He's trying to describe his society, but he is not taking that material from the landscape of his own land. So, Essays on Man, important work, and it shows his taste and his standard. Now let's move towards other important works of this first period of the literary career of Alexander Pope. And Windsor Forest is the poem that was completed and published in 1713. And here too he proceeded as Virgil had done. And in this poem he proceeded from the pastoral vein to the Georgic style. The Georgic poem or the book in Georgic style, it often deals with agricultural or rural topics. And here we see that Alexander Pope celebrates the rule of Queen Anne, as we see Virgil in his book celebrated the rule of Augustus the Caesar, who was one of the important Roman ruler. So here again we see that Alexander Pope is copying the style of the great ancient writers. So they are following those landmarks, those high ideals, and trying to meet those high ideals. So Windsor Forest, actually he painted the real beauties of nature, and he has described the real beauties of nature in this poem. So Windsor Forest is again on the pattern and the style of the ancients, and here again he copied the form of the ancient masters. Now let's move towards another important work of this first period, and this is one of the very famous work of Alexander Pope. The name of this work is The Rape of the Lock. This is the masterpiece of Alexander Pope, and this very work is included in the syllabus of our course. And we see that this is a mock heroic narrative poem, and it was written in the form of satire. And this is the poem where Alexander Pope satirizes a small incident by comparing it to the epic world of the gods. Most of the time we see the epics are the poems where the poets try to narrate those issues that are very mighty, that includes the very serious issues of this world. But here we see that Alexander Pope, he has selected a very small incident, and he used that form of literature that is often being associated with very mighty type of incidents of the life. We see that what happened in The Rape of the Lock. This is the poem. Lord Pater cut a lock of a hair from the head of a young beauty, and that very lady is named as Arabella Fermor. And Alexander Pope used the name Belinda for this lady in the poem The Rape of the Lock. This very joke led to a quarrel. Lord Pater cut a lock of hair from the head of young beauty, that is Arabella, and this joke led to a quarrel between two families, and Pope was appealed by a common friend. His name was John Carroll, and he appealed Pope to pacify this very issue by turning the whole thing into a joke. Actually, Alexander Pope is trying to settle down the issue that actually started with a joke and led to a quarrel between two families. So this very poem was very much connected to the happenings of that time period. And we see that in this poem, The Rape of the Lock, Alexander Pope tries to reflect the real situation of 18th century. So this poem is very much connected to the realities of that time period. Now let's move towards the second phase of Alexander Pope. And in this time period, the major work from Alexander Pope were the translations of Iliad and Odyssey. And these two important works of Homer were translated by Alexander Pope, but one of the important objection that is being raised against this translation is that it has a real discrepancy, and the discrepancy or the shortcoming of this very translation is that neither Pope nor his age could understand the real spirit of Homer or the Homeric world. So we see the translations, but there is the lack of real understanding of the spirit of the Homer. So Pope has written a very brilliant and striking piece, but it has shortcomings. So in the second period we see the translations of the major works of the Greek literature. In the third period we see that here too Alexander Pope is imitating the ancient masters, and here we see that he is copying or he is imitating the satires and epistles of Horace. So from very start we see that Alexander Pope is idealizing these very important personalities. Here we see the important work, the epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot, and in this epistle, which is being written by Alexander Pope to his friend Dr. Arbuthnot, is a satire, and this satire is in poetic form, and he is addressing his friend. So satire is there, and we see that these satires are in epistle forms of Horace. Another important work of this third period is the Dunciad, and this is the landmark of mock heroic narrative poem by Alexander Pope, and this work was published in 3 different versions at different times from 1728 to 1743. So within this time period he has published this poem in 3 different versions. Actually this is a mock heroic narrative poem, and in this poem again we see that the poet celebrates a goddess of dullness and the progress of her chosen agents, as these very agents bring decay and tastelessness to the kingdom of Great Britain. And this poem is a long, elaborate satire on the dunces, and this poem satires bad poets, pedants, and pretentious critics of that very time period. So these are the 3 important periods in which we can classify the literature of Alexander Pope. In the first period we have 4 pastorals, then we have important work, the essays on criticism, Windsor Forest, one of the important place in the life of Alexander Pope, and he has painted, he has brought that very place into his poetry and gave it a permanent form in the world of literature. Then comes The Rape of the Lock, the masterpiece of Alexander Pope. In the second period we have important translations from Alexander Pope, and he has done the translation of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. And then we have the imitation of Horace. He imitated satires and epistles of Horace, and the important epistle is the epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot. And then we have another mock heroic narrative poem of Dunciad. So these are some of the important works. After that, in the third period, another important work is there, the Essay on Man, a poem in 4 epistles. This poem is also in epistle form, and this poem was published between 1733 and 1734. It is basically an effort to rationalize or we can say that justify or validate the ways of God to man. When you read this very phrase, justify the ways of God to man, we see that it is a variation of John Milton's claim that he raised in the opening lines of the Paradise Lost, that he will justify the ways of God to man. And we see that here in the Essays on Man, there is a defense of the moral government of the universe, and there is an explanation of the physical and moral evils. So it is considered with the natural order God has decreed for man, because man cannot know God's purposes. He cannot complain about his position in the great chain of being. And these very concepts of the great chain of being, which are most of the time philosophical concepts, these are being used in this poem of Alexander Pope. And we see that here he is justifying that we must accept that whatever is, that is right. So again, he is like Milton, justifying the ways of God to men. So this is the poem that popularized optimistic philosophy throughout England, and even it has influenced the rest of the Europe. So these are important works of Alexander Pope. So I hope that after listening to this lecture, now you will be having a good idea about the characteristics of the classical school of literature, and then you might be having clarity about the personality of Alexander Pope. Thank you very much for listening passionately. Allah Hafiz.